When communication stops, the mind starts creating stories. And let me tell you something. The stories people create in silence are usually far more painful than reality itself. That's the danger. When two people stop talking, stop checking in, stop explaining themselves, the human mind immediately tries to fill in the blanks, and most of the time, those blanks get filled with fear, insecurity, doubt, and hurt. Nobody sits in silence thinking, everything is probably fine. No. Silence makes people overthink. Silence makes people question their value. Silence makes people wonder if they still matter. A woman doesn't get a text back for 2 days, and suddenly she's asking herself, did I do something wrong? Is he losing interest? Is there somebody else? A man notices his partner becoming distant, and now he's sitting there thinking, maybe she's tired of me. Maybe I'm not enough anymore. See, now nobody's dealing with facts. They're dealing with assumptions, and assumptions are dangerous because people react emotionally to things that may not even be true. I remember hearing about a couple who had been married over a decade. Good people. Loved each other deeply. But life hit them hard financially. The husband got quiet because he was stressed, embarrassed, and trying to figure out how to fix things. He thought staying silent would protect his family from worry. But his wife interpreted that silence differently. To her, his silence felt cold. It felt like rejection. She started believing he didn't love her the same anymore. Now here's the painful part. Neither one talked about what they were feeling. So while he was silently carrying pressure, she was silently carrying pain. And every day they said less and less to each other. No yelling, no major fights, just distance, quiet dinners, short answers, long nights. And eventually they looked up and realized they had become strangers living in the same house. That's how silence works. It slowly rewrites the relationship. And the scary thing is, the longer silence lasts, the more real those imagined stories become. People begin treating each other based on assumptions instead of truth. Somebody starts pulling away emotionally because they think the other person already stopped caring. And now both people are hurting, both people are confused, but neither one is speaking honestly enough to stop the damage. You know what communication really is? It's oxygen. That's what it is. Relationships cannot breathe without it. You can love somebody with your whole heart, but if you stop communicating, eventually the connection starts suffocating. Because love is not built only on feelings. It's built on understanding, clarity, reassurance, effort. Sometimes one honest conversation can prevent months of emotional pain, but pride keeps people quiet. Fear keeps people quiet. Ego keeps people quiet. And meanwhile, the relationship keeps drifting further apart. People don't always need you to have all the answers. Sometimes they just need to know you still care enough to speak, to explain, to reassure them that the silence is not abandonment. Because when silence lasts too long, people stop feeling connected. And once somebody feels emotionally alone long enough, they start learning how to live without you. That's why communication matters so much. Don't let silence tell a story your heart never intended to write. One of the most dangerous things that happens when two people stop talking is this. Pride gets louder. The silence may begin because somebody is hurt, confused, or overwhelmed, but after a while, it stops being about the original problem. Now it becomes a battle of ego. Now both people are sitting there, waiting, watching, hoping the other person makes the first move. And that right there has destroyed more relationships than the actual issue ever did. Because pride will convince you that reaching out makes you weak. Pride will whisper in your ear, don't call first. Don't apologize. If they cared, they would come to you. Meanwhile, two people who genuinely love each other are slowly drifting apart, simply because neither one wants to look vulnerable. That's sad. You know how many families don't speak anymore over arguments they can barely even remember? Brothers who grew up sharing the same room, now passing each other like strangers. Mothers and daughters carrying years of silence because neither one wants to admit they were hurt. Friends who miss each other deeply but keep pretending they moved on just to protect their pride. And the crazy part is this: a lot of people would rather lose the relationship than risk rejection. Think about that. People are so afraid of hearing no, so afraid of not being received the way they hoped, that they choose silence instead. But silence doesn't protect relationships. It slowly kills them. Every day, communication is delayed. Emotions harden. What could have been fixed with one honest conversation turns into months or years of emotional distance. I once heard about 2 lifelong friends who stopped speaking after a misunderstanding involving money. Neither one stole from the other. Neither one truly wanted the friendship to end, but both felt disrespected. Both wanted an apology. So both stayed quiet. Months passed, then years. One day, one of them ended up in the hospital unexpectedly, and when the other man came to visit him, he broke down crying beside that hospital bed. He said, "We lost 10 years over a conversation neither one of us was willing to have. 10 years. You cannot get time back, and pride has no problem stealing time from your life." See, maturity is not always about being right. Sometimes maturity is saying, "This relationship matters more to me than my ego." That's strength. Real strength is being emotionally secure enough to have difficult conversations. Real strength is being able to say, "I don't like where we are right now, and I don't want silence to become permanent." But a lot of people were raised to believe vulnerability is weakness, especially men. Many men grow up hearing things like, "Don't cry. Don't express too much. Stay tough." So when conflict happens, instead of communicating, they shut down emotionally. They disappear into silence because they don't know how to process pain openly. And women do it too. Sometimes hurt turns into emotional wall so high that nobody can get through anymore. Instead of expressing disappointment honestly, they retreat into distance and wait for the other person to figure it out alone. Now, both people are suffering in silence, each one secretly hoping the other cares enough to fight for the connection. But relationships cannot survive on silent expectations. At some point, somebody has to become brave enough to break the cycle. Somebody has to care more about healing than winning, because when pride becomes louder than love, nobody really wins in the end. At first, emotional distance feels uncomfortable. You notice it immediately. The conversations get shorter, the laughter becomes rare, the energy changes. You can feel it sitting at the dinner table, riding in the car, even lying next to each other at night. Something feels off. And in the beginning, both people still recognize the gap. Both people still feel the tension. But here's what makes emotional distance so dangerous. If it goes on long enough, people start adapting to it. Human beings can get used to almost anything. That's the scary part. A couple that once talked for hours now barely says good morning. And after a while, it starts feeling normal. A parent and child who used to share everything suddenly only exchange short messages about responsibilities and bills. Friends who once laughed every week slowly become strangers who only interact through social media likes. At first it hurts, then eventually, people stop reacting. And when people stop reacting emotionally, that's when relationships quietly begin dying. See, love doesn't usually disappear overnight. It fades through neglect, through silence, through emotional absence. Little by little, people stop expecting affection. They stop expecting effort. They stop expecting understanding. They lower their expectations just to avoid disappointment. That's survival mode. There are people right now living in the same house with someone they no longer feel connected to emotionally. Sleeping in the same bed, but feeling completely alone. Smiling in public while privately carrying loneliness so heavy, it drains the life out of them. And because there's no major fight, no dramatic breakup, they convince themselves everything is okay. But peace and emotional numbness are not the same thing. Some people aren't at peace in their relationships. They've simply become emotionally exhausted. They stopped speaking up because they no longer believe anything will change. They stopped expressing needs because disappointment became too familiar. That's what prolonged silence does. It trains people to emotionally detach in order to protect themselves. I remember hearing a woman say something that broke my heart. She said, "I stopped telling him I was hurting because every time I tried, nothing changed. So eventually, I learned how to suffer quietly." Think about that. There are people carrying silent pain every single day because they no longer feel emotionally safe enough to communicate honestly. And when emotional safety disappears, intimacy disappears with it. Because intimacy is not just physical. Real intimacy is feeling seen, heard, understood. It's being able to say, "This is what I'm feeling," without fear of rejection, dismissal, or being ignored. Once emotional distance becomes normal, the relationship starts operating like a machine instead of a connection. You handle responsibilities, pay bills, raise children, show up to events. But emotionally, the warmth is gone. Now you're functioning together instead of growing together. And people stay in that space for years sometimes, not because they're happy, but because they became comfortable with disconnection. They forgot what genuine closeness even feels like. That's why communication matters so much. Relationships need emotional maintenance, just like anything else valuable in life. A plant doesn't die because somebody decided to destroy it overnight. It dies because it stopped getting water consistently. And human connection works the same way. Attention matters. Affection matters. Words matter. Presence matters. You cannot continuously starve a relationship emotionally and expect it to remain healthy. And the longer people live disconnected, the easier it becomes to imagine life without each other. That's the truth many people ignore. Once someone learns how to survive without emotional support from you, they slowly stop depending on the relationship for comfort altogether. That's why silence can become dangerous if it's left unresolved too long. Because eventually, what once felt painful starts feeling permanent. Silence has a way of revealing the truth people try hardest to avoid. When the talking stops, when the effort slows down, when days turn into weeks without real communication, you begin to see clearly who is truly willing to fight for the connection and who was only there when things felt easy. That's one of the hardest lessons in life, because a lot of people say they care. A lot of people say, "I'll always be here." But silence exposes the difference between words and commitment. It reveals who values the relationship enough to protect it when things become uncomfortable. See, when communication breaks down, effort becomes visible. One person keeps reaching out. The other keeps ignoring. One person keeps trying to fix things. The other keeps avoiding the conversation. And eventually, the person carrying all the emotional weight becomes exhausted. You cannot keep pouring love into a connection where only one person is investing emotionally. At some point, exhaustion replaces hope. I remember hearing about a woman who spent years trying to save her marriage. She suggested counseling. She tried conversations. She wrote letters expressing how disconnected she felt. She prayed for change. She fought for that relationship with everything she had. But her husband kept shutting down emotionally. Every difficult conversation ended with silence. Every attempt to reconnect was met with distance. One day she finally stopped trying. And when she stopped, her husband looked shocked. He said, "Why are you giving up now?" But the truth was, she hadn't given up in that moment. She had been slowly breaking inside for years. He only noticed the silence once she matched his. That happens more often than people realize. Sometimes people become so comfortable receiving effort that they don't notice the relationship is surviving on one person's emotional labor. And by the time they finally recognize the damage, the other person is emotionally drained beyond repair. Silence exposes imbalance. It reveals who consistently makes excuses and who consistently makes effort. Now understand this carefully. Not every silence means somebody stopped loving you. Sometimes people are dealing with pain, fear, trauma, stress, or emotional immaturity they don't know how to communicate properly. But even then, healthy relationships require accountability. At some point, effort has to show up. Love without effort creates confusion, and confusion is emotionally exhausting. People should not have to constantly guess where they stand in your life. Genuine care becomes visible through consistency, through communication, through action. You know what hurts the most? Watching somebody fight harder to keep their pride than to keep the relationship. That pain cuts deep, especially when you've shown up for them repeatedly, especially when you've forgiven, understood, sacrificed, and remained patient. Eventually, you start asking yourself difficult questions. Why am I the only one trying? Why do I keep chasing someone who keeps pulling away? Why am I carrying this relationship alone? And those questions force people to wake up emotionally. Sometimes, silence gives you clarity you refused to see before. Sometimes, the absence of effort finally opens your eyes to a painful truth. You were fighting for a connection the other person had already stopped prioritizing. That realization hurts. There's no easy way around it. But clarity is still a gift. Because once you see the truth, you stop begging for bare minimum effort. You stop shrinking yourself to maintain one-sided relationships. You stop confusing inconsistency with love. And that doesn't mean you become bitter. It means you become wiser. See, healthy relationships require mutual effort. Nobody should have to constantly earn basic communication, affection, or emotional presence. Real connection is built when both people choose each other consistently, especially during difficult seasons. Because when someone truly values you, silence will never last forever. Pride won't matter more than the relationship. Distance won't become comfortable. They will find a way to communicate, to repair, to reconnect. And if they don't, silence eventually answers the question words were avoiding all along. Now, here's something a lot of people don't understand about silence. Not all silence is destructive. Sometimes silence becomes the very thing that opens people's eyes. Sometimes distance becomes the mirror that finally forces someone to look at themselves honestly. Because when all the noise disappears, when the arguing stops, when the distractions fade away, people are left alone with their thoughts. And in those quiet moments, truth has a way of becoming impossible to ignore. Some people discover how much damage they caused. Some people realize how deeply they hurt someone they loved. And some finally recognize how long they've been abandoning themselves, trying to save everybody else. Silence can either become a prison or a place of transformation. The difference depends on what people choose to do during that silence. See, healthy silence creates reflection. It gives people room to calm down emotionally, process pain, and think clearly instead of reacting out of anger. Sometimes stepping away from constant conflict is necessary. Sometimes people need space to mature, heal, and gain perspective. But unhealthy silence is different. Unhealthy silence is avoidance. It's punishment. It's emotional manipulation. It's shutting down communication while expecting the other person to suffer in confusion. And a lot of people have experienced that kind of silence. Somebody disappears emotionally and leaves you wondering what happened. No explanation. No reassurance. No effort to repair things. Just distance. That kind of silence creates anxiety, insecurity, and emotional exhaustion. But healthy silence creates wisdom. I remember hearing about a father and son who stopped speaking after a terrible argument. Both were stubborn. Both felt disrespected. Months turned into years. Holidays passed without phone calls. Birthdays came and went with silence. And during that time, both men carried pain neither one wanted to admit. The son kept telling himself, if my father cared, he would call me. The father kept thinking, if my son respected me, he'd come apologize. Pride kept them apart. Silence kept the wounds open. Then one day, the father became seriously ill, and when the son finally walked into that hospital room, all the anger disappeared the moment he saw his father lying there, weak and fragile. He broke down crying and said something powerful. He said, "We wasted years trying to protect our pride, while life kept moving." That's the thing about silence. Sometimes it reveals how short life really is. Sometimes distance teaches people what truly matters. Because when someone is no longer constantly available, when their voice is missing from your life, when their presence is absent, you start realizing how much space they actually filled in your heart. And for some people, that realization becomes the beginning of healing. But healing requires honesty. You cannot heal while pretending nothing is wrong. You cannot reconnect while avoiding every difficult conversation. At some point, somebody has to become emotionally mature enough to say, "We need to talk honestly about what happened." That takes courage. It takes courage to apologize sincerely. It takes courage to admit mistakes. It takes courage to lower emotional walls built out of hurt. And not every relationship survives silence. That's true. Some relationships end because the damage goes too deep or the effort never becomes mutual. But even then, silence can still teach valuable lessons. Sometimes silence teaches you to value communication more. Sometimes it teaches you to stop settling for emotional neglect. Sometimes it teaches you how important emotional presence really is. And sometimes silence introduces you to yourself. It shows you where you need healing, where you need growth, where you need boundaries, where you need forgiveness. Because every painful season carries a lesson if you're willing to learn from it. The problem is, many people waste silence feeding resentment instead of pursuing growth. They replay arguments in their minds, build emotional walls higher, and convince themselves vulnerability is weakness. But growth happens when people use silence for reflection instead of revenge. That's when healing begins. Not when pride wins. Not when somebody loses the argument. But when wisdom becomes more important than ego. And sometimes, one honest conversation after a long silence can rebuild a connection people thought was completely broken.